We'll get started in a couple of minutes. We've got to let it do a quote. You see that from all of the PowerPoints, which is Barbra. You know what? We'll do the book. The one. Welcome, everyone, to Past Tensions, Present Progressions, or How Linguistic Anthropology Can Transform the World, a panel to celebrate the contributions of Susan Phillips. A few pictures of visiting former graduate students at Tucson. You want to come help me read this? Okay. So we put this panel together to honor the very varied work of Susan Phillips to linguistic anthropology over the years. And I want to read a quote from one of her most recent publications, Phillips 2021. Forms of discourse are understood to be socially organized and in a relationship that is expressed in part through both their commonalities and their differences. Forms of discourse are also related through culturally shared metapragmatics. We have great conscious control over how we include or fail to include units of discourse, and in how and why we order them. And some of that gets articulated verbally. Finally, forms of discourse enter into power-laden relationships. Forms of discourse are ranked in various ways, and some higher ranked forms have a greater influence over the creation of shared realities than others.
Recording in progress.
This is an excerpt from a publication called How Linguistic Anthropologists Conceptualized Relations Among Different Forms of Discourse in Approaches to Discourse Analysis. And I thought that it was an excellent summary of the types of approaches that Susan's work has taken. And for any of us former graduate students, we know, or we certainly remember from our courses with Susan, that we learned a very broad range of approaches to the study of discourse analysis, and ethnography. And I think it's something that has influenced all of our work, as you'll see in today's papers.
Oh, it is? Can you all see the panel abstract? Okay. So as Jackie was saying, I mean, Susan has had a profound impact on all of our, oh, yes, thank you so much. Sometimes, right? So Susan has had a profound impact on all of our lives. And I just want to say quickly, my first introduction to Susan was actually through her ethnography that she wrote about Warm Springs, which is a place that I hold very near and dear to my heart, having kind of spent my summers there growing up. And that's where my mother grew up and where most of my family on that side still live. My second introduction to Susan was when I started at Arizona and was her student and started getting some of the most critical feedback I've ever received. And what she pushed me to think about and take very seriously and actually modeled for all of us, and as Jackie was noting, was really how to carefully connect linguistic data, because I was fascinated by form and grammar, with ethnography. And if it hadn't been for Susan's gentle but firm pushing me and asking me questions and saying that I can't just take for granted that because you have agency in certain kind of grammatical forms, that you have agency out there in the social world, right? I wouldn't have pushed myself and tried to figure out how these things were interconnected. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panel abstract. So in the 1960s and 70s, socio-political movements in the US confronted the discriminatory practices and prejudiced structuring of society through peaceful protest, civil rights marches, and occupations. At this time, linguistic anthropology began to gain its footing institutionally and intellectually, shifting its focus from language as object for preservation to language as social action. Contributing to this shift, Dr. Susan Phillips' work drew attention to the subtle and visible dimensions of institutional racisms and sexisms by investigating language use and interaction within marginalized, underserved communities of practice. One of her earliest contributions to anthropology took shape through her dissertation research at Warm Springs. Working with the Confederated Tribes, Phillips developed her research in relation to the community goals focused on the education of children and youth. She revealed not only the invisible aspects of interactional styles that can and do affect student performance and success, she demonstrated an ethical, responsible model for research with Indigenous groups. Her attention to the tacit dimensions of social inequalities is a theme found throughout her research. Methodologically, Phillips' contributions emphasize the unpacking of participant roles and their grounding in particular contexts, as well as the analysis of the actual discourse that participants produce in face-to-face interaction. Her transcripts of court data, both in Tucson and in Tonga, reveal the subtle cultural framings in tandem with the institutional frameworks that constrain interactional performances in service to the recognition of truth or fact. Her article on discourse analytic methods lays out the process by which linguistic anthropologists can render culture salient through the identification of units of analysis and a discourse comparative method. Theoretically, Phillips' insights have been central to the movement toward language ideologies. and their role in the distribution of power institutionally. Through her investigation of how discourse participates in the structuring of society and the creation of social inequality, her scholarship has continually underscored the need for theory and science to pay attention to both tacit and overt processes that produce and reproduce intolerance and bias, and for the academy to realize its own complicitness in institutionalized forms of marginalization.
Okay, our first speaker is going to be Diane Riskedahl.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Jackie and Barb, for organizing this. And thank you, Susan, for shaping us in so many ways. So let's see. Does that have the notes on the front, or is it just the? Yep. Okay.
It does.
Yeah, if we can make it, because all I have are transcripts. So.
But I think it's just.
Oh, okay. Someone was nodding. Sorry, Jackie. Okay. So one of the key things that I learned in Susan Phillips' Linguistic Anthropology core course, the first linguistic anthropology course I ever took, is the importance of working from the data outwards. I'm sort of the opposite trajectory of Barb, where I came from cultural anthro into linguistic, and she came from linguistics over to linguistic anthro. But finding patterns in transcripts, discerning shifts in genre, evaluating pronoun usage were all the start of understanding the role of language in the constitution of the social world. And as someone coming from cultural anthropology, where it seemed more often than not that order was being imposed theoretically from the outside on the messiness of everyday life, this inversion seemed radical and simultaneously much more illuminating of the human experience. But one of the central insights that emerged in this course was that while there was discernible order in language structure itself, patterns in language in use also had something to tell us about the workings of social power. How order was manifest on a turn-by-turn level offered a potential diagnostic for the role of language in structural inequity and historical change. I was excited by the revelation of how heretofore discrete theoretical concepts became much more rich and complex when understood as dialogically constructed, whether spontaneously in interaction or historically across time. By looking now at my recent collaborative research team experience, and specifically focus group data collection, this paper is my initial sort of foray into thinking about how researchers navigate their participant alignment, as well as the shifting communicative goals with different phases of a larger project. In her research, Phillips has focused analytical attention on how discourse organizes interpretive diversity. She has asserted, quote, "A great strength of anthropological discourse analysis lies in the ways that transcripts are related to what goes on outside them." And that, quote, "Methodologically, it's important to distinguish between the kinds of meanings that can be inferred from discourse data alone versus those which can only be interpreted by looking at additional discourse data and attending to local understandings and meaning making." I want to begin to explore both the complexity of the data, but also the complexity of data collection in this 3-year multidisciplinary project, which a Lebanese-Canadian friend of mine who's an epidemiologist in health studies sort of added me in. I was the qualitative person in a sort of sea of quantitative psychologists and health studies people. So in the interest of not reifying a single encounter, I try to explore the articulation of multiple levels of quantitative and qualitative data collection by focusing on interactional dynamics of those who collected the data. The project itself was focused on exploring the complexity of Syrian newcomers' transition to Toronto with a specific interest in parenting dynamics. It had 2 phases of both survey data collection with 120 participants, and then follow-up focus group phases with 4 groups of 3 newcomers in each, 2 groups of women, 2 groups of men. In addition, there was a secondary phase that was supposed to happen in Lebanon, which sort of collapsed across COVID and across time, but I won't be talking about that today. So my central means for contextualizing discourse data in this paper is through a debriefing with research assistants who participated with me in the focus group sessions and transcription of the qualitative data after the first phase of survey data was collected. And in our debriefing sessions, we spent time discussing their differing experiences collecting this data. And in order to dig a bit more fully into the qualitative material, we had copies of printed transcripts, again, a tradition I picked up from Sue Phillips, with highlighted markers, of course, to highlight the issues that we saw occurring in the focus group sessions. Now, as noted in the panel abstract and just mentioned by Barb, methodologically, Susan Phillips has contributed to emphasizing the unpacking of participant roles and their grounding in particular contexts. So in both the survey and research design, or in the research design, a conscious choice was made to create participant alignment to facilitate the research process. The research assistants were Syrian undergraduates or newly graduated social science majors from a Toronto university, and they were familiar with the dynamics of research projects, but had never led focus groups themselves. The PI and I decided that it was very important that we have other recent migrants from Syria involved in the research process, not only for dialect purposes, but due to the trauma of civil war and the context that many refugees had immigrated in. We felt it would be most sensitive for participants to discuss the process of transition with someone themselves who had gone through the transition, even if under differing circumstances. So now in reviewing their experiences with the survey data collection, one component that became apparent in discussions was their ongoing efforts to collect what the PI had indicated to them was significant material. And I'm going to just pop up, I'm not really going to dig into these transcripts in order to save some time for later, but I'm going to sort of highlight some things that come up in them. The steady probing of certain topics from multiple angles was motivated by their understanding of what the key themes were that were being explored. So here I'm sort of interested in why I'm putting these transcripts up, which are probably a bit small for people to read, but I was starting to think about in looking at how they were talking about the research process and how a lot of their understandings of both data and the process of research itself was being carried over from the survey data collection into the focus group session. So that was kind of one of my interests in looking at in this paper. But when you start to look at the comments here, there's issues about questions. Should we add questions? Should we take them out? Should we change them? Are the topics okay? And then towards the end, Rana, who's the lead research assistant on the project, starts to highlight how there's a sort of evasiveness in answering questions about children. And she actually comments, that they're not being truthful, not answering positively. And this is something that sort of comes up throughout the survey data collection phase. So she notes how both the types of questions and their phrasing created problems for the interlocutors. And this led to inaccurate or even what she felt were false responses. There was also a recognition that at some point with the repetition in the survey instrument that there would be disengagement. Here we have Ahmed talking about, it was a lot of the same answers. Rana says, yeah, you feel them clocking out in their head. And then Ahmed says, yeah, I clock out too. So this kind of understanding of how the whole experience itself creates a sort of shared feeling of disengagement with the process. Let's see. But throughout it became clear from the comments by research assistants that the voice of the PI was often present in their choices when conducting the survey. And I want to sort of think about the hidden or silent role of the PI in the survey interactions, because I feel like they appeared much like Candy Goodwin's discussion of the importance of back regions in evaluating collaborative work talk and situated activity. She's highlighted how the importance of linking the dynamics of ground operations at the airport with interactions at the gate in order to fully understand the front stage interactions. And this is a complex work setting. And as Goodwin highlighted, participants are linked both immediately with those co-present, but simultaneously with those they communicate with at a distance through technology or other forms of interaction. And here I would argue that the survey instrument is sort of an extension of the PI's voice. So these multiple participant frameworks in the data collection process are key to making sense of the later focus group interactions. In the debriefing sessions, the research assistants comments on how participants grew frustrated with the survey question. They would even disalign themselves with the PI, empathizing with the participants as a means to continue the surveys when they would stall. So there, became these sort of, interactional strategies that they would use. So as Goodwin notes, of these kind of complex work activities, talk shapes an expanding horizon of possibility, making relevant the articulation and deployment of the tools in the setting, as well as the invocation of collaboration from coworkers, or in this case, disalignment from coworkers, right? So there's a sense of distancing in order to kind of help the process move along. So the sliding scale of front and back regions then in the data collection process also indicated a shift of sensing alignment for the research assistants in regards to who they were orienting to during the interaction. At some points, they were frustrated with interlocutors for not engaging with questions. At other points, they were sympathetic to their disengagement and felt it themselves. At some points, they felt distance from the PIs, and at other times, they were looking at the process from her perspective. Now I'm going to move on to the dynamics of the focus group to discuss a little bit more this issue of alignment. One strategy for creating alignment in these sessions, is just a general personal introduction. And this would often, sort of position us socially. Through the introductions, we tried to establish what Erickson Schultz had described as co-membership, an aspect of performed social identity that involves particularistic attributes of status shared by participants. But such self-positioning here, and sort of goes through her experience, transitioning around the world before getting to Canada. But then she sort of gets to the point of, if you'd like to introduce yourselves first, then we can start with the questions. So this self-positioning, even though this seems kind of succinct and on the point, often did lead to sort of a more general questions about details, how we got to different places that we were before it started. So that would often create an atmosphere that was more conducive to interacting. So in addition to this initial self-positioning, further active alignment attempts occurred by Rana for making a connection with participants in the focus group. As I just mentioned, they commented, the RAs commented extensively on how participants often seemed anxious to only present relocation in a positive light. And this, caused us to discuss a few strategies of how to disrupt this. And one, which Rana used, was to draw from her own experiences to highlight, sort of her disappointment in the transition process. So in response to the question of how are your desires, what are your desires for your kids, in relocation? She gets an immediate response saying, yeah, everything is provided and good for us. We try not to worry about how we're going to pay the rent. We live a happy life. And she sort of senses, she highlighted this in the transcripts, that this was a sort of moment that she could see it going in that direction of just sort of status quo responses. And so she tries to modify the question, talking a bit about herself, what if I offered to change something for you or improve? The questions may be a little bit hard, but what would you like to change or improve? Alice says, language only, I want to make it better. Language being a sort of ongoing thing throughout all survey and focus group discussions. And she keeps going, saying, for example, say I wanted to learn how to drive. I want a car, and everything would be close then instead of having to commute for half an hour. So after these comments by Rana, there was an extensive discussion about how much it costs to own a car in Canada, issues of insurance, whether it was better to take public transit. So it really shaped the topic focus of the interaction. And while this illuminated issues related to independence, finances, and precarity, I thought it was a success. The conversation did stray from her earlier query about aspirational desires for children and from the topic of language. So in her sense, in looking at the transcript, she felt her intervention distracted the participants from the larger goal of the focus group. So one theme in the survey data collection was, in addition to integration, was whether one's responsibilities, masulia, in relation to one's children had changed from Syria to Canada and how this affected daily life. So in this excerpt, which I'm sure is quite hard to read, sorry about that. Sorry, no. These women were talking in this excerpt from one, both women in this context, Zaka and Farah, are discussing here their expressions of sort of feeling alone in transitioning. So the question was, do you find life in Canada easier in Syria? Easier here than in Syria? The response is no. To be honest, Syria was a much easier life. I felt alone here and the difficulties are hard. So I have underlined on the transcript here the sort of scaffolding that happens across the interaction, where the notion of difficulties is then picked up by Rana, but she converts it to say, so the difficulty is that you don't find anyone to help you with the kids. So shifting it away from feeling alone to shifting it to, caring for the children. And Zaka goes back to, you don't find anyone here. And then she starts talking about daycare. Rana, refers to another interlocutor. And they say the difficulty is also, there's a new, you're carefree in your own country, but here there's a new language, new country, and you feel alone. And then Rana frames it with, you feel more responsible. And this musalliya, which I have highlighted here, is then reiterated by Farah, say, yes, more responsible. So there's a kind of uptake of this notion of responsibility, which had been in the previous interaction. So this is an example where the term responsibility as well as difficulties was probed for and solicited through back and forth interaction. The concept moved both participants, Zaka and Farah, from expressing a personal emotional state to talking about the intersubjective sensibility of caring for children and responsibilities. Notably, there's a loss of the focus on personal mental health of the individual, a reflection on their own sense of alienation with the revising that Rana provides in her effort to draw in the research topic of the relationship with children and the notion of responsibility. So while I'm still trying to explore this phenomenon in the data, I do want to emphasize that this was not unidirectional just from the researchers down, but there are examples in the other direction as well, where we've got Rana sort of being shaped by her interlocutors, even her question formation, right? So what are things that you were expecting that turned out to be true, mazboot? And then they say true or better. Farah says true or better, and she said, or better, yeah. So they modify the question in order to kind of respond to it in the way that they want to. And then they say, she says, I was expecting them to have problems with hijabs, but it wasn't like that. Rana inserts here a sort of value statement. So you didn't feel like an outsider with the hijab. And they, are comfortable contesting that. It was not about feeling like an outsider. We expected it to be harder. Fatima chimes in, we found people very accepting and no racism. And then interestingly, here at the end, Zaka goes back to the notion of something being true or mazbuta, saying, this is one thing that did turn out to be true. There isn't any segregation or racism. So in this excerpt, Rana finds both her elicitation question and follow-up rephrasing challenged, and the dialogical nature of the group dynamic, as well as perhaps the more engaged or invested participants, creates a space for pushback. Rana reported feeling like this focus group session was very productive and that she wanted to try to add more focus groups into the research plan to create some balance and checks on the survey data. So now in conclusion, because I'm going over here. So this paper has begun to explore how there can be a blurring of communicative goals in larger research projects, which combine survey and more open-ended focus group data. Dick has highlighted how the epistemological contrast between quantitative or positivistic data collection and qualitative data collection have different understandings of meaning making. And I've tried to explore how research assistants felt frustrated and constrained by the search for discretely observable objects in the world that can be objectively recorded in survey data. They expressed a social distance both from the participants they were interviewing as well as the larger project and even the PI at times. As these research assistants moved into more open-ended constructivist frameworks for qualitative data collection, it appeared that notions of key terms, focal discrete objects of research were drawn back into the discussion and shaped the kinds of techniques employed, elicitation techniques employed. The debriefing comments looked at here highlight both the recognition of this distinction as well as the blurring of this distinction in the actual data collection process. And it seemed that this led to a blending of both the expectations and style of the survey communicative event with the focus group communicative event. Now, in addition to the dialogical process of individual data collection sessions, I found that the research assistants and I engaged in a dialogical process of interactive learning, which spanned across various phases of the research process. We were shaped by participant responses, where shared meanings were achieved through the dynamics of interaction. We were also shaped by each other's perspectives on the research process, making the disentangling of an authorial voice largely impossible for me. And this is something I'm planning to explore more extensively with Rana in a larger paper together. But this initial exploration of discourse data emerging dialogically in this project is also in dialogue with my broader academic training under Susan Phillips. As I continue to probe these interactions and explore the shared construction of data, I realize how she's always in the back regions of my work. And I'm very glad that I was able to bring her out into the public performance of the front region in today's presentation. Thank you.
And before we introduce our next speaker, I neglected to read the title of Diane's paper. What you just heard was Data in Interaction and Collaborative Research Projects. Our next speaker is Thea Strand, and the paper is Symbolic and Material Values of Dialect in the Linguistic Ideological Ecology of Rural Norway.
Jackie, will this reach down to your table so that I can read off of mine? And if not, I can just. Okay, sure. Watch out for the tone. Yeah. Thank you. Good morning. Susan's work on language ideologies, and especially her critical work on multiple and diverse language ideologies interacting, has been really central to my own thinking about my research in rural Norway. And so I'm going to be working through some of her contributions here in that context, applying them there. So in the rural central Norwegian district of Valdres, the traditional local dialect exists alongside and interacts with various forms of standardized Norwegian. Across a range of discourse forms, spoken and written, casual and formal, public and private, the Valdres dialect, called Valdresmor or Valdres, often has high symbolic value. Is it too loud? Sorry. Oh, yeah. Valdresmor is understood on the one hand to be a marker of rurality and local social belonging, and on the other to represent traditional Norwegian folk culture, both local and national. However, as Susan Phillips has found in her analysis of Tongan women's talk in tapa producing work groups, the cultural centrality of certain kinds of language does not always or easily align with their material value in the broader economic system. As Phillips argues, speech that is pervasively highly valued ideologically and aesthetically does not necessarily have great economic value. The relationship between the cultural value and economic value of speech in a global economy is fluid, subtle, and complex. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in business life in Norway and in Valdres, there's been a longstanding preference for normative Norwegian and increasingly English in most marketing materials and outward communication, which is indicative of the national and global economic power of these linguistic forms, even as Valdres residents express strongly positive views of their dialect in the explicit metalinguistic discourse. Recently, though, as Valdres has transitioned from a traditional agricultural economy built on small-scale dairy farming to one focused primarily on cultural and recreational tourism, the local dialect has been selectively utilized as a source of added value in the marketing of all manner of local products and experiences. Sorry, I don't know why that was animated. Using bits and pieces of Valdresmore in touristic marketing works precisely because of the dialect's cultural value, derived from its association with traditional rural folk culture and the centrality of that idealized vision of rurality to Norwegian national identity. At the same time, family farming is in precipitous decline. The productive activities with which Valdresmore has historically been linked in practice are no longer economically viable in a globalized food commodity market. In her work considering the coexistence of diverse ideologies, Phillips conceptualizes of an ecology of ideas located in various forms of discourse, the analysis of which can help us understand, as Phillips writes, why and how cultural constructs not only change, but also endure, how they shrink and expand, how they're restricted and elaborated across discourse environments, and how non-dominant ideas get preserved over time. Ideas find a compatible locale and colonize it, Phillips wrote. They do not so much flow across social terrains and saturate them like water as they are like plants moving into ecological niches, some of which are more hospitable than others at a given moment in time. So my aim in this paper is to consider how rural language, which has long been symbolically central and materially marginal in Norway, seems now to have found a compatible locale and colonized it. So we can observe in the expanding use of Valdresmore in new, if somewhat niche, discursive and economic domains. So I first need to just provide a little bit of historical background before getting to more of the current specifics. Since the late 1800s, Norway has had two coexisting and competing written norms called bokmål and nynorsk. These two official national varieties are legally equal. The bokmål written norm is used by a strong majority of Norwegians, and it dominates in popular print and text-based media of all sorts. Bokmål is a relic of several centuries of Danish colonial rule, which ended in 1814, and during which Danish replaced Old Norwegian as the language of government and business, centered in Norway's major cities. In dominant national linguistic ideologies, Dano-Norwegian bokmål is associated with modern urban life. The nynorsk written norm, on the other hand, was originally a post-independence project begun by national romantic linguists in Norway around 1840. As a self-consciously nationalist project, nynorsk sought to include Norwegian linguistic forms and features that were the least influenced by Danish, and its development thus foregrounded in synthesized rural dialects, including Valdresmore. And those were at the time and continue to be perceived as distinctly and more purely Norwegian. In contemporary Norway, bokmål and nynorsk are co-official, but only about 15% of Norwegians prefer to write in nynorsk. The coexistence of these two written norms and the persistent coexistence of ideologies supporting each of them individually, as well as the dual norm situation itself, indexes an environment that's hospitable to language ideological diversity and Norwegian sociolinguistic variation, which also extends to Norway's many local and regional dialects, including Valdresmore. So from the early years of independence up to the present, Norway's rural communities and dialects have been symbolically central in popular ideas about the nation and national identity. And as I already mentioned, rural Norwegian life and livelihoods have historically been built around small-scale family farming, primarily dairy cattle in the case of Valdres and also some sheep. So in practice, peasant agriculture is the primary economic setting in which rural Norwegian dialects that we have today developed and were spoken for hundreds of years, but that's changing quickly in the 21st century. Still, the cultural value attached to rural dialects is evident both in practice and in metalinguistic discourse, where it was on full public display in a 2005 dialect popularity contest on national radio that featured exclusively rural dialects among the top 5 based on listener votes. And some of you may have heard me talk about elsewhere that Valdres won that contest. Of course, there's also ideology at work in popular understandings in meta-language that constructs bokmål, nynorsk, and dialect as separate, distinct, and internally coherent forms of Norwegian. As Phillips once noted in a paper on tongue and speech levels, such constructs normativize or idealize linguistic phenomena, which are more variable and complex behaviorally than the constructs suggest. And they idealize not only linguistic phenomena, but also sociocultural phenomena, not just overgeneralizing, but also projecting a self-image of society that gives salience to certain aspects of social ordering over others. So in the case at hand, the ideological contrast between rural and urban places and people is made salient, with rurality having high symbolic value, but also occupying the material periphery, both literally in the sense of relative physical or geographic isolation, as well as in economic terms, with rural farmers in Norway long lagging behind urban workers in wages and standards of living. Not only are rural dialects idealized, despite their variable use and near constant mixing with normative language, rural people are also overgeneralized as simple folk carrying forward valuable national traditions, including family farming and so-called artisanal food production, but also folk music and dance, material folk arts, and wild landscape conservation. All of this brings us back to the rural present in Valdres. The entirety of the district is now branded as the Valdres Nature and Culture Park, where the traditional Valdres dialect is being put to distinctly modern and profitable uses in the form of marketing slogans, business names, and self-conscious performances of rural speech in interactions with visitors in the booming entertainment and hospitality sectors. Written bokmål and nynorsk are, of course, also both used in Valdres, and most native Valdres residents also continue to speak Walish in local social settings. The district, or the Nature and Culture Park of Valdres, is located in East Central Norway, and its lower valleys are dotted with small farms and the year-round homes of about 18,000 people. But Valdres also boasts spectacular mountains on 3 sides and a large number of cultural and archaeological attractions in its lower valleys. And it's now also home to nearly 20,000 cabins, which are owned or used primarily by urban Norwegians who are understood to speak normative bokmål or bymål, which is city language, and that's constructed in opposition to traditional folksy rural dialects like Walish. Valdres has actually been a tourism destination welcoming relatively wealthy urban visitors since the turn of the 20th century, when there was a rail line built between Oslo and Fagernes, which was completed in 1906. But through the Valdres Nature and Culture Park, or the VNK development project, Valdres's symbolically valuable natural and cultural heritage resources are increasingly commodified. VNK administrators have focused especially on marketing artisanal and artistic traditions and folk music and dance, things like that. But one of the 13 goals that they specified in the original charter for the VNK project in 2007 was to stimulate the use of the Valdres dialect. So historically, there's been a well-maintained ideological distinction between spoken language, where dialect is welcome and even expected, and written language, where writers have to choose between bokmål and nynorsk. But official encouragement for the public and outward-facing use of Walish points to new ideologies of language that have taken root in Valdres's new economic environment. Phillips writes that ideologies are like plant species, and I love this metaphor. Multiple species can coexist in the same environment. They accommodate one another and are part of each other's environment. New species of plants may or may not displace those species already present, so too with ideas. Ideologies in Norway supporting the public and materially profitable use of written dialect in marketing have not displaced those that demand bokmål or nynorsk in formal writing in general. Rather, they're accommodating one another and perhaps also making visible the ways in which ideologically differentiated forms of language, to quote Phillips once again, merge, interpenetrate, and draw on one another for their power and effectiveness in many aspects of their expression, as Phillips found for the interplay of tongue and speech levels across discourse genres. While longer texts in Valdres's touristic marketplace, like brochures or museum text panels, still require bokmål or nynorsk, a variety of local products, particularly traditional foods, now use written dialect in labeling and other marketing. Handwritten roadside signs have long advertised fresh, handmade local foods like kurv, which is a cured blood sausage, or rymme, sour cream, using dialect. But using Valdres in more professional marketing is a 21st century development. For instance, the Valdres meat producer Helle now labels its products with the slogan "Ekta godt," really good. Both words in the Helle slogan are marked local variants, though they're easily recognizable to Norwegian outsiders. Ekta corresponds to ekte in both bokmål and nynorsk, while godt has its close counterpart in godt in both of the written norms. The word kurv itself is also distinctly local, while the term spekepølse is used to refer to cured sausage throughout the country. And the design team behind these labels and slogans talks about them as representing Valdres roots, traditions, authenticity, and quality for this relatively expensive and exclusive local product. The shift is evident in newer uses of Valdres elsewhere in the commercial landscape as well. Local entrepreneurs in Valdres' central business district, the adjacent towns of Fagernes and Leira, have chosen dialectal names for new businesses, including Grepaget Cafe, serving espresso-based drinks, which usually Norwegians drink drip brew. So this is traditionally not at all Norwegian. Designer clothing store here, Agelaus, they've got on the right of the screen, and an art gallery in Fagernes called Bortot Glase. So Grepa, Gut, Agelaus, Bortot, and Glase are all considered by locals to be distinctly Polish forms. They're markedly non-standard. So we have maybe especially notable among these, the art gallery, which opened in 2018, and the shop facade is really thoroughly contemporary in style. There are no semiotic links here to a traditional rural aesthetic, except for the linguistic form of the gallery's name. None of these businesses primarily deals in traditional cultural products, but the store's names and signage stand out among other businesses and add symbolic value in Valdres' commercial center, where bokmål and international brand names, a lot of English ones, otherwise continue to dominate. Outside of directly commercial contexts, local place names, which often incorporate dialectal forms, have long been visible on rustic and carved signs that greet visitors to some of the outlying cultural and recreational attractions, like stave churches, archaeological ruins, and mountain trails that are used for hiking and skiing. But over the last decade, some of these machine-produced, a little bit more uniform signs have been distributed by VNK. They still have the dialect-inflected place names, but they've replaced this kind of hodgepodge of older handmade carved signs to create a more cohesive brand identity in Valdres' outdoor spaces as well. So we have Iron Age and Viking Age sites and structures, along with outdoor activities of hiking and skiing that all have long been imagined as central to traditional national Norwegian identity. But today they're also understood in much more global terms. And for the hiking and skiing, maybe in particular, these are now aligned with discourses of health and fitness and a kind of retreat from the intensity of urban life and wilderness conservation and sustainability as well. So when we take the broader context into consideration, we can also observe some of these aesthetic and cultural shifts in other places. I said earlier, there are more cabins than there are permanent residents in Valdres. We see, if we look around the mountain landscape itself, some of these rustic 1 and 2 bedroom cabins, or 1 and 2 room cabins, sorry, that were cherished as vacation retreats throughout the 20th century are being rapidly outnumbered by luxurious mountain vacation homes that might still be built with grass roofs, which are traditional as well as sustainable. And they might be referred to as cabins, but they also always now have electricity and indoor plumbing and these soaring glass windows to take in the pastoral scenery. So this points also to Norway's economic ascendancy on the global stage in the 21st century, after lagging behind a lot of its European neighbors from the Middle Ages into the 1990s. So as we can see in so many of Philip's examples from Tonga, the interplay among local, national, and global ideologies and systems of value is significant here. Valdres' key products of agriculture and timber historically were sent out and sold into national and international commodity markets, which were controlled largely from urban administrative centers. And young people often received education that would either keep them engaged primarily with other locals in agriculture or providing goods and services to other people in the community, or prepare them to leave the community for post-secondary education outside the district and to stay in those more metropolitan centers to pursue professional careers. As global capitalism is increasingly built demand for retreating into nature, as well as for distinctive branding and the production of unique and artisanal experiences and places, new discursive and economic environments have opened up in Valdres that allow pro-local ideologies to flourish. The particular ecological niche of local cultural recreational tourism is fertile ground for the reproduction of pro-local, pro-dialect, neo-traditionalist ideologies. Let's see. I think that's the wrong slide, actually. Oh, that's okay. Phillips's work and theoretical insights have most often dealt with ideologies evident in spoken language produced within bounded speech events. So this linguistic data that I've presented is quite different. It's written and it's also often removed from face-to-face interaction. But I think marketing slogans, brand names, place names, these can also be understood as specialized units or genres of language, and their production and circulation as a form of linguistic and cultural practice, which demonstrates Phillips's point that there's theory in use, that there are specific and multiple ideologies that speakers, writers, and readers employ in their use and appreciation of Valdres more in new contexts. The persistent markedness of Valdres's rural linguistic and semiotic resources, of course, still points to ideological structures that construe urban Norwegian forms as normative and most materially valuable at the national scale and in business life. And despite its increasing visibility in Valdres's developing economic landscape, Valdres more as a spoken language of everyday life for those who live permanently in the valley is less evident in public. Local older folks still perceive it as waning quite rapidly among youth. But still, the revaluation of rural language and culture in local branding and marketing schemes also suggests that there's complexity in the language ideological configurations that contribute to the construction of Valdres and Valdres more as modern sites of traditional culture. So as Phillips has argued, we can observe here that ideas may be compatible or incompatible to varying degrees, and their relationships may change over time, generally transforming how ideologies are configured in discourse and creating a historical layering of different varieties of ideological multiplicities. Thank you.
Point. Oop, here we go. There we go. Our next speaker is Rebecca Wood, and the title of her talk is Language Documentation and Revitalization, an opportunity for the creation and negotiation of methodological practices.
So training in linguistic anthropology has taught us the importance of listening to multiple perspectives to better understand a particular context, topic, or issue. However, as Susan Phillips has so clearly demonstrated in her work over the years, we do not always equally value all those voices. That is, some voices are heard much louder and clearer than others. And this is true with the theme of language documentation and language revitalization. The fields of linguistics and anthropology have for decades dominated the discussions and approaches and ownership of language materials. Due to the power disparities between universities/publics and minority communities, there are profound impacts on these communities' abilities to reclaim their languages and cultures, especially when institutional language and political ideologies are given more weight. Impacts range depending on communities, but may include, one, the lack of access to recorded materials, or conversely, sensitive materials are universally accessible to the public. Two, linguistic articles and concepts can be incomprehensible to the speech community. And three, biases of what counts as knowledge and who is producing said knowledge. Many of these ideological perspectives can be remedied with a shift in power dynamics back to the minority communities and through a change in research methodology. Inspired and informed by the instrumental scholarship by Phillips, this paper explores the importance of developing a meaningful collaborative research project that benefits the research community as they see fit and highlights the advantages of viewing data as part of a cultural process for the community, researcher, and academia. In the description that follows, I situate the moral and cultural lessons embedded with Salish narratives and discourse to demonstrate the value of adhering to local diverse knowledge production. My research with the Salish Kalispé population in Western Montana documents and analyzes narrative patterns, styles, meaning, interpretations, and discursive ideologies of the language and culture within the storytelling genre. This project developed from a grassroots approach with community members and further enhances their own revitalization efforts. This means that the Native community members determine the direction of the project, control any materials produced, and make determinations of how scholarly and pedagogical materials develop and are disseminated, including this talk. Beginning this project from a collaborative place was due in part to the previously established relationships that were created during my graduate fieldwork with the community. Having a working and respectful relationship allowed for far deeper conversations around the project development and implementation. Salish language revitalization efforts have been steadily increasing over the years, beginning in the 70s, trying to combat the predominant shift to English. In the early years, this work took the form of language recordings, often without transcription or translation, summer immersion camps, and language lessons. Building upon past accomplishments, the community also began a language immersion pre-K through 8th grade school in Closum, and most recently have also developed an extensive language revitalization curriculum. And this curriculum is the purpose of the overall project and a significant source of the data collection and analysis. As there are a limited number of available speakers remaining that are able to contribute to the linguistic and cultural interpretations, the community requested research be conducted on the grammatical structure of the language and significantly how individuals creatively demonstrate their communicative competence through the narrative process. In this research project, I therefore documented and analyzed Salish narratives and texts under the foundational assumption that, quote, storytelling is a cultural phenomenon. There were two primary activities that occurred during the fieldwork: the linguistic analysis of previously recorded narratives, as COVID limited my ability to obtain new recordings as previously planned, and the investigation of the sociocultural meanings and uses of language across multiple contexts. Audio and video recordings dating from the 1980s to 2011 from elders were transcribed and translated by community members, and then I analyzed them for morphological structures and individual stylistic variation. Specifically, me or news-telling stories were the focus of the investigation rather than the traditional skolumt or coyote stories. And investigating these particular narratives, the SME narratives, allowed for the comparison of a much larger range of storytelling techniques, and the SME narratives are not reserved for specific times of the year, so they can be utilized in greater detail in teaching curriculum. Importantly, the recordings selected by the Salish Kalispé Culture Committee could be used in future teaching materials, as they also do not contain culturally sensitive information. In addition to the analysis of these narratives, I collected ethnographic fieldwork ethnographic data through the participant and observation of language courses for students in the Salish Language Educator Development Program, SLED, which is highlighted here on the screen on the left. Importantly, due to COVID-19, this intensive language and cultural program that trains language activists and future teachers was conducted online, allowing me to interact daily with community members. Importantly, I was afforded the opportunity to immerse myself in the language for hours on end per day during the online fieldwork with the community in a shared and develop a shared in-depth awareness of the cultural underpinnings present in the language. The ability to participate in the language course brought a greater awareness to the notion of how language is culturally enacted in discourse and narratives. To discuss openly the language lessons and stories with classmates and teachers created greater linguistic comprehension of words, phrases, and concepts, provided clarity of the Salish epistemologies and practices, and developed a supportive community for learning in which all voices were valued. The analysis of the recorded narratives and ethnographic immersion proved to be fundamental in not only highlighting the patterns and functions of traditional language and culture in a community where the language is highly endangered, yet still enduring and growing. These events also demonstrated to the learners and teachers that they are themselves becoming the experts, not just the elders, importantly, or the academic experts. Phillips provides a framework for how research should be respectfully and ethically conducted, which relates directly to the success of, quote, attending to the local understandings and meaning making through anthropological discourse analysis. The shift away from expert rhetorics, Jane Hill, of course, to the diverse community experts creates a pathway to clarify how culture is enacted through language. Through the participation in the language learning sessions, I collected data on numerous cultural practices related to historical events, epistemologies, plants and animals, and daily life, as well as the goals, successes, and challenges that do arise from language and cultural revitalization work. Partaking in daily language sessions and discussions allowed me to realize the centrality of storytelling to the socialization of language ideologies and cultural practices. As learners, we came to realize the strength and identity embedded in the language and how crucial it ties the individual to community and to place. We began to see how the Salish language creates a different way of thinking about the world through the descriptive nature of language, the flexibility of word order that focuses the listener on specific details, and respect for all things that are present in the teachings. There was great overlap in moral lessons described in the stories that were taught in the language lessons and the previously recorded narratives, and only through the immersion and discussions with learner community was I able to understand the weight and influence of the words. Additionally, I gained a far deeper comprehension of the linguistic and cultural meanings of each utterance, which enables me to further contribute to the development of pedagogical materials for the community. Without decentering my own power and knowledge production, this would not have been possible. So to briefly illustrate the power that recentering voices allows, I offer the following excerpts. And the following examples were selected to also demonstrate the common moral threads presented and discussed during the immersion sessions. Each example drawn from the language lessons for sensitivity issues provides a glimpse into how students were socialized to and through the language. Students were provided the story in Salish with minimal translation and were asked to take turns describing the meaning of the text, also in Salish. Upon completion of this task, the text would be translated and discussed at length to clarify any linguistic or cultural confusion. Often, the work referenced in these passages is the revitalization work of a handful of remarkable community members. So I'm going to pull from this level 2 stories workbook, because again, my work is for the community and this is publicly available. And you can't read Salish, so I'm going to give you the English. So this is from one particular elder, Patlik. So in line 1, this is the right way we are doing our language and our thoughts. Everyone's things are going in this right way. When again you see our fellow people, we are thankful for that. A long time ago, the people understood and spoke good. It will be like this as time goes on. Then we'll go on and see our children. Many of them will be speaking one language. A lot of them are speaking already. Some of them, if he, she speaks Indian, they will respond to you. And in line 2, I am teaching you all not to be ashamed, and you won't be ashamed of your ways. Always your hearts will be good because you are Indian. You are thankful for that because we will be smart, us people. We learned a lot, but we weren't taught a lot. We did learn this, quote, is this to be my work? And he's referencing missing out on learning his culture because of colonization. And in line 5, it's not going to end, the goodness for us, for our people. That's why we always are going to try to do our best. We don't say it's done. No, we don't say that we're not Indian anymore. Heck no, it's not that way. That's why we always try our best in what we are doing, our work or our ways. And in excerpt 2, this is from a little bit older passage recorded in the 1990s. And this is from Mitch. And he says, which then our ways will not be gone. No, not disappear. And that disappear is the ampt, which is a metaphor, which it means melt, which is really interesting how they use that. And in line 11, see, and that's why I'm telling you guys that I'm thankful for you all. Don't get bored of your work here. When you do this work, you guys hear this, you will hear us talking, your elders, and you will think it's like you're there. It's like you're an Indian from a long time ago. It's like you will see the ways that we are teaching you. In line 12, put it in your head, put it in your thinking. When your work is good, it's because I told you. No, this isn't a lie. It's not like the white writings or books. No, our stories aren't just random things. Yes from yes. What you were taught is truthful. This is from everything I see, and I think I teach to you all. And in line 13, these things from the animals, they go to the people, and then to the people's ways, and then continue on further. Coyote stories are acting like that. You will not make into something worthless this work we're doing. You will not think, oh, already this way is from the past or old traditions. We will not bother with it. You are all doing a big, important, valuable work. You all like our work. Your thoughts, you put it into your working, it will be good. And these stories were narrated to create connections with traditional cultural practices and to help reinforce the importance of language revitalization work. One can see the lasting impact the negative institutional language ideologies and in turn practices have had on the community, which were continually stated throughout the fieldwork process. These language lessons also provided learners with the platform to discuss much of the trauma that continues to exist, including notions of shame and conversely, pride and strength that ensues when one returns to the Salish teachings, or enfloopus, which means falling back into place or going in the right path. Each student and teacher brought with them different backgrounds, life experiences, and varying degrees of Salish knowledge, yet each furthered the overall program objectives of revitalizing the language and perpetuating culture. By examining how these students internalized, negotiated, and passed on the lessons, one can begin to see how local language ideologies are shifting to reflect the power and control minority communities have over their own knowledge production. So building on the critical work of numerous linguistic anthropological scholars on the indigenous languages of Native North America, Allers, Basso, Bauman, Davenport, Field, Crosskey, Leonard, Meek, Nevins, Palmer, Purley, Webster, to name a few, but especially Susan Phillips. My research further highlights the need for Native communities to define their own histories and futures through their own stories. Through a genuinely collaborative approach to furthering language documentation and revitalization work, this project utilized the ethno-linguistic approach. The very nature of the project allowed all participants to further their knowledge and respect for the Salish language and project, allowing all participants, and culture, including the community in all aspects of the project, from project conception, data collection, analysis, and distribution of materials, creates a more nuanced, developed, and reflexive work. This project supports the goals of the Salish Kalispé community by connecting the people to the stories and landscape, and has the potential for future language pedagogical material development. This work hopefully also provides a basis for other scholars to conduct research with respect, reciprocity, and flexibility. Language, as Phillips notes, is a form of resistance, and we as a discipline need to ensure we step aside when necessary so that those who wish to empower, those who we wish to empower can truly be empowered through their own choices. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Kate Graber. The paper's entitled On Blind Markets and Bank Account Goats, the Language of Social Justice Capitalism.
Jackie would be nice and gentle with the laptop. Let's see if it put the title up on the next screen. Oh, the answer. Oh no. Oh, there we go.
Yes, yay, yay. Okay, great. Thank you so much to Jackie and Barb for organizing this panel, also known internally as the Fans of Susan panel, and to Dick for serving as discussant, and most of all to Susan for inspirational work over many years. When I was finishing graduate coursework at the University of Michigan, Susan visited and gave a seminar on discourse and institutions. And I couldn't really fit it into my schedule, but I audited it anyway because I just thought her work was so cool and it was so relevant to my research. I was about to do dissertation fieldwork in Russian media institutions that produced native language materials, I hoped. And a couple of Susan's insights and exhortations really influenced how I approached that research and continue to. For one, she exhorted the members of our seminar to attend to the middle scale of institutional practices, the middle level, as she put it, where you're more likely to find multivocality and the crucial interfaces between these sort of large scale social entities like states and local community organizations or initiatives. This was a much needed corrective at a moment when everyone was talking about global versus local phenomena in very binary terms. And she was right. Regional level media production turned out to be where all the most interesting action was in that project. And second, some of Susan's most provocative and best known work shows how those institutions that are assumed to be monolithic arbiters of blind justice, the courts are in fact pervaded by contestation and diversity in the individual proclivities of judges. The uneven application of justice reflects and reproduces inequalities that enter the courtroom below the level of awareness, effects that are central to the functioning of the legal system, she argued, but persistently and perniciously denied. This is an insight with implications for all sorts of other institutions that appear from the outside to be, and that figure themselves as, monolithic. So for instance, and univocal. So for instance, state-funded media institutions in Russia that appear to be monolithic arbiters of linguistic authority are in fact characterized by heterodox practices within, and journalists act on quite different language ideologies based mainly on the technological affordances of the platform they're working in, but other factors too. Yet that key feature of the media institution, its internal linguistic ideological diversity, is erased by audiences and by journalists themselves to support instead a view of media language, news language, and a news register produced by a unified institution, the media, as we say in many, many different languages. So this paper extends Susan's observations about the ideological heterodoxy of monolithic institutions in a different direction to 21st century neoliberal economic discourse. And an extreme example from Mongolia, we can see how inequalities are not only reflected, but also produced through interactions between Mongolian economic institutions and experts and the people that they're supposed to be benefiting, namely herders living mostly outside the cash economy and other people who work inside the Mongolian cashmere industry. So in the larger project of which this paper is a part, I'm exploring the production and global circulation of Mongolian cashmere to determine how different forms of value, economic, social, linguistic, moral, accrue to material goods and subsequently transform society and culture through their transnational movement. The book that I'm at the beginning of writing, Textures of Value, Embodiment, and Experience in the Mongolian Cashmere Industry, holds in view an entire commodity chain. It focuses on interactions such as between herders and their goats, between brokers and herders negotiating prices, in political debates over the future of Mongolia's economy and environment, and at points of sale to consumers. How at these different nodes in the circulation of cashmere fiber is value dynamically produced in interactions. I'm kind of trying to bring some interactional analysis to economic anthropology. It's an uphill battle. Which systems or regimes of value travel from one node to another, and which do not? And the first chapter from which I'm drawing today discusses the Mongolian political economic context within which these values are sussed out. And it's organized around the discursive slippage between herders, environmental activists, and government elites who espouse a form of social justice capitalism. So why is justice necessary in this context at all? Although Mongolia's economy is diversifying in some ways, it is based first on mining and secondly on semi-nomadic pastoralism or mobile pastoralism, that is, animals and animal products. Like mining, Mongolia's cashmere industry is still primarily extractive. By money and by bulk, it is still mainly a matter of exporting raw natural resources. Actually, that's why on this billboard for Gobi, they have to say world #1 raw cashmere producer. Mongolia is not the leading producer of cashmere products, it's the leading producer of raw cashmere. So Mongolia is the world's second largest producer of cashmere after China, supplying as much as 40% of the world's annual consumption in raw fiber and finished garments and what is known in the industry as semi-processed fiber, including spun yarn and woven cloth. Because the overwhelming majority of Mongolia's total production is in raw fiber, and because the majority of that goes officially or unofficially to China, in fact, Mongolia finds itself supplying Chinese industry with yet more raw materials and seeing little of the financial or employment benefits of a vertically integrated industry. And here, vertically integrated meaning that all aspects of sourcing, production, and distribution are done in country or within a single company. The homegrown cashmere industry represents potential independence from these transnational reliances, especially to Russia and China. So it's a form of economic nationalism, promising social justice for Mongolians at the international scale. And at the national level, there's an even more acute problem with the industry. Herders have come to rely on their spring cashmere pull, like meaning they literally pull the cashmere off the goats. So it really is pulling. They've come to rely on their spring cashmere pull as their primary source of cash for the entire year and have become trapped in a debilitating debt cycle with high interest bank loans. So searching for a solution to this intractable problem, policymakers refer vaguely to an agentive market, Zachzel, and often describe herders as childlike, irrational economic actors. In policy documents, financial news analysis, and ethnographic interviews, and in other interactions, we can see a language of social justice capitalism that has emerged in this context. Economists take the market to be something abstract and fair because it is applied equally to an undifferentiated mass of herders and industry workers. And to a great extent, ordinary Mongolians not specifically trained in economics agree, by assuming in a tight ideological association that capitalism brings with it the benefits of democracy. So Paula Sabloff, among other anthropologists, has demonstrated this by, for example, repeatedly interviewing Mongolians in the same locations to document their increasingly positive perceptions of capitalism over time. Mongolia's post-socialist context here is critical. The dismantling of state socialism in the 1990s devastated the economy, so that joining a world market appears to many people to be sort of salvation and part and parcel of joining a democratic world order. Accompanying this deep desire for a capitalist democratic future is intense anxiety about Mongolia's and Mongolians' ability to meet expectations of capitalist production, especially around time management, quality control, and industrial standards. The industry is rife with secrecy and rumors, and my field notebooks are filled with these like notes to self, like, do not publish this. This is not to be, mostly around numbers. It's a rare interviewee who will offer even a range for the price that she receives or pays for raw cashmere, or even for finished garments, sometimes even when they're publicly available in other ways. This lack of transparency makes it difficult for herders to demand a fair market price for their raw cashmere fiber. So in response to this problem, the national government set up an exchange system that regularly makes transparent the going market price based on their knowledge of exports, the export price paid by businesses being higher than what herders are receiving from brokers. So a lot of money is being sucked up by brokers, but they also benefit the economy in other ways. The exchange's public market price is only published online, however, and it is unclear how many herders are aware of it or even can access it. Meanwhile, NGO workers, otherwise advocating for herders' rights, often feel forced to participate in this culture of secrecy in order to establish partnerships with buyers. Yet transparency performs a crucial discursive function. Some factory owners and managers are more than happy to let me wander their factory floors and film the production process, even when they refuse to share fairly basic statistics on production and profit. Indeed, YouTube and social media are full of factory documentation. You can Google it right today, as are Mongolian factories' own marketing materials. In part, these efforts to document the production process are a matter of businesses reassuring potential foreign investors that they can expect standardized production and quality control. So this image, for instance, comes from a brochure on investment opportunities. Indeed, when the Prime Minister visited the site of a major factory fire to oversee repairs, he did not miss the opportunity to reassure foreign investors and correct a longstanding stereotype of Mongolian national character, saying, it's been around 10 days since the fire broke out. Gobi Kashmir was able to do repairs and resume operations in a very short period of time. Being able to overcome such a huge obstacle in such a short time proves that Mongolians are capable of supplying promised products on time in accordance with contracts made with local and foreign companies. He's like hitting every single
checkbox on a list of expectations that he imagines foreign investors to have and companies to have. It also demonstrated that our emergency workers are always ready for any unforeseen disaster. Similarly, when a small Ulaanbaatar company invites a fashion designer or a visiting ethnographer to film their factory's production, or when a fair trade store posts photographs of herders combing their goats in a pastoral scene on their walls, they provide a sense of transparency, showing all of the points along the commodity chain and suggesting that there are no unfair labor practices here. And I would note that this is not peculiar or particular to Mongolian companies. For example, the New York Times recently published this ode to capitalism that likewise implied that transparency in the commodity chain, in this case in Loro Piana's very controversial practices, produces social justice, advertising a controversial arrangement between, in this case, Mongolian herders and the high-end Italian fashion house, Loro Piana. Performative transparency here becomes the key to simultaneously demonstrating fair labor practices and reassuring buyers that Mongolian factories adhere to international expectations. It is a form of standardization that becomes especially important in the absence of an international certification process for cashmere products. In this process of standardization, what at first appeared to be more diverse, one might say democratic, forms of public economic discourse are winnowed and controlled. So for instance, here's the Daily Post. The Daily Post publishes financial news and market analysis in English, German, Hungarian, Indonesian, Japanese, Korean, and Russian. And so here I'm reproducing some of it in English. I think it's auto-translated, but still. And this kind of site uniquely juxtaposes the opinions of industry experts, like the chief inspector of the Central Customs Laboratory here and the deputy minister of food, agriculture, and light industry, their opinions from industry experts alongside those of government policymakers and herders. But in practice, Zachsel, the market, is understood very differently in different contexts. Among salespeople working doing the sort of floor labor of selling cashmere in Ulaanbaatar, foreign markets are the ultimate target of development, but they're also really poorly understood. So for example, in this case, I was fortunate to have some research assistants, and in this case, Joljiko is the research assistant, and she is saying, do you know the cities? She's talking to a salesperson who says, I don't really know the cities. In any case, goods are exported there. And then they also go to the Chinese market, like they go outward. And later she says, you've been working for 3 years. Are there opportunities for further growth in your company? There are. Now we are introducing ISO 9001, which just rolls off her tongue, actually, amazingly, these standards of production. So now there are a lot of products in foreign markets. In other words, we meet standards, and therefore we can access these foreign markets that are not very well understood. Again, the salespeople keep bringing this up as like, it's a way to sell it on the overseas market. There's an opportunity out there somewhere outside of my expertise. Among herders, the Delchinzachtel, the world market, figures mainly as an excuse that brokers use to justify not paying them the prices that they had expected based on the preceding year. So in 2019, I was able to spend a month during the busy spring combing season, combing with herders, and in like interactions or while we were doing this like manual labor, occasionally people would bring this up and say like, oh, who are you going to sell? Hey, Batra, who are you going to sell your cashmere to this year? And the other guy would say like, oh, I don't know. Last year I didn't feel like I got a very fair price from that guy from the IMEC Center. And the other guy would say, like, oh yeah, he's always saying it's like Zachsel, it's like Delchin Zachsel. Like they were very skeptical of arguments that the prices that they were receiving had anything to do, in fact, with a market outside of Mongolia. But none of these interpretations from salespeople or herders appear in public discourse about the economy. So how are some herders' voices included for the sake of performative transparency, performative participatory democracy, and social justice, while others are excluded? One way is by routinely characterizing herders' economic decision-making as infantile. Commentators talk constantly about herders treating their animals, and specifically their goats, as bank accounts or banknidans. And it's often used in this very tongue-in-cheek way. So instead of it being something that would make them sound more rational, it ends up making them sound like it's kind of funny, like ha ha ha, like they use their animals as bank accounts. Rhetorically, this trope suggests a couple of things. First, that herders live, if not outside the cash economy, outside the system of modern banking. Second, that they nonetheless subscribe to a logic of accumulating personal wealth and saving it in some kind of vessel, if not a bank, then the body of a goat, until such time as it is needed and it can be cashed in the form of cashmere. The first suggestion is dangerously untrue. Most herding families have significant bank debt, and their relationships with banks drive most of their, much of their economic decision-making. The second is not untrue on the face of it, but when it is invoked by economists, they imply a challenge to smooth market functioning. Like, why are they using their goats as bank accounts instead of banks? The problem from the economist's perspective is the goats' illiquidity relative to cash. The trope is invoked for a specific discursive function. So to return to this ecology of ideas, to use Susan's phrase, on display in the Daily Post, here the herder who is included, Amar Jarkal, a herder from Tumburbulagsum in Hufskol, he's speaking about national and international level macroeconomics in terms economists use. He is not a typical herder using sort of everyday discourse. Herder's economic discourse is included and prioritized in public forums like this only if it appears rational and meets these very narrow expectations. In conclusion, expert commentators on Mongolia's cashmere industry are ultimately proposing almost exclusively neoliberal market-driven panaceas as forms of social justice. Most ordinary Mongolians, again, do not disagree with them about this, but the explanatory frameworks that economists muster in their commentary, blind, so fair markets, subsidies, and corrective market regulations, are differently interpreted by the herders and industry workers who are most affected. This discursive diversity is obscured in publicly circulating economic discourse, like the Daily Post, through these subtle mechanisms of selection and performative transparency in a form of discursive come social ordering that should feel very familiar from Susan's lasting work. So thank you, Susan, for bringing our attention and my attention to the ways that social inequality may be reproduced through the very institutions that are supposed to rectify it.
Yeah. I just have to find it's right here.
So our last two presenters will be, or speakers, here we go. Our last two speakers will be coming to us via Zoom. So our first presenter, our last presenter will be Debbie Cole, and the title of her talk is Using the Study of Language Ideologies to Connect Theory to Classroom Practice.
Can y'all still see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, stop me if you can't hear me. Thanks again, Jackie and Barb, for organizing this panel. A bit like Thea, I've organized my talk around some quotes from Susan's work, but I'm going to use them to tell you some stories and reflections about how her scholarship has influenced my teaching. So I thought it might be useful to quickly summarize the argument I want to make here. So here's the idea. Susan's scholarship on language use in institutions has shaped the way I teach. Her work shows how we create and recreate institutions through language use. In working on language ideologies and institutions, Susan notes that salient and prevalent ideas are themselves forms of power. One salient and prevalent idea in linguistic anthropology, thanks in no small part to Susan, is that language has a reality-creating capacity. This idea that language creates reality is therefore a form of power. Classrooms are institutional socio-spatial contexts created and recreated through language use. When we make the idea that we use language to create reality explicit for our students, we can share with them the power of this idea. Once the idea of the reality-creating capacity of language becomes salient and prevalent for students as well, we can then go about creating different institutional realities in our moment-to-moment turns at talk. So I'll start now with the passage of Susan's work in which she describes how Warm Springs social activities made it clear in their socio-spatial arrangement that everyone present could participate to some degree. People are seated in such a way that all present are facing one another, usually in an approximation of a square, and the focus of activity is either along one side of the square or in its center, or a combination of the two. I have fond memories of interacting with Susan in 4 spaces in Tucson: her office at the U of A classroom she lectured in and in which I TA'd for her home where she invited students from time to time for celebrations, in a seminar room upstairs in the Howry building. Interactions with Susan in that seminar room profoundly shaped not only the direction of my scholarship, but also, as I've come to discover only much later, my teaching philosophy and practice. That seminar with Susan had profound effects on the direction of my dissertation research. I went off to Yogyakarta to study the language ideologies surrounding public performances of contemporary poetry in Indonesia. Oh, hold on, I'm so sorry. I'm going to go back. About the seminar room. The seminar room had a long rectangular table in it, squeezed in between archives and artifacts and overshadowed by tall filing cabinets. There were maybe 10 seats at the table, but chairs were brought in every week to create an even larger rectangle around them. Every week, Susan sat at the table, but not always in the same seat. The day's readings and her notes spread out in front of her. Her manner was calming, scholarly, focused, welcoming, and week after week, while we worked our way through text after complex text, the positive, focused energy, ours and hers, never seemed to wane. The course was a graduate seminar on language ideologies, ostensibly for linguistic anthropology students, but students from many other programs joined us. Years later, students from Susan's course became valuable colleagues who supported me at important moments in my career, our only prior connection being Susan's class. What happened there? How did Susan enable so many eager students with different educational backgrounds, all crowded together, feel like we each had the space to talk, to question, and to respond? I wasn't used to putting on my observer hat back then. I was too caught up in the participating, so I can't reconstruct the interactional dynamics of that seminar, but I can trace some of the effects it had on my own teaching practice in the years since. That seminar with Susan had profound effects on the direction of my dissertation research. I went off to Yogyakarta to study the language ideologies surrounding public performances of contemporary poetry in Bahasa Indonesia. I knew that key to focusing on ideology was focusing on power, but I wasn't interested in looking too closely at power. I think I thought that power dynamics were too far removed from what I wanted to know, and I didn't yet see the relevance of the ideological hegemony of the state. I took my first teaching job after graduation in the Rio Grande Valley, along the border between Mexico and Texas, in a place called Edinburgh. Having just completed my dissertation, I was used to thinking about language through the framework of ideology. I knew that there was a mix of Spanish and English in the linguistic ecology of the region, so during my first weeks in class, I asked students to tell me about their linguistic repertoires. Over and over again in those first days of classroom introductions, students said something like, "I don't speak any language really. I don't speak Spanish, and I don't speak English." And I thought, well, this is strange because I speak English and I understand you just fine. Over time, my students helped me to understand the ideologies that shaped their local evaluations of language competence. They told me about how, while working service industry jobs, they encountered upper-class Mexican tourists who shamed them in Spanish for having a Spanish last name on their name tags, while not being able to speak proper Spanish. They talked about how family and teachers constantly admonished them not to mix languages, not to speak Tex-Mex, or in some cases, not to speak Spanish at all. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the notes section. Oof. All in order to maintain a position in the local middle class and to linguistically differentiate themselves from working class migrants who spoke more Spanish than English. All those power relations I'd wanted to avoid during my dissertation were now inescapable. And what's more, as the figure of authority, the teacher in an English department no less, I represented the institutionally constituted ideology that aligns standard language forms with good citizenship. Realizing that their power experiences with people in my same situation and my same position of authority had shaped their evaluations of their own language, I had to ask myself, am I the baddie? I don't want to be the baddie. So what am I going to do about it? Over the next decade, my students and I articulated and analyzed the language ideologies that had shaped their evaluations of local language practices. These discussions came to drive my research agenda as well as my teaching practice. I began to create learning activities in which students could begin to unmake or revise the effects of these language ideologies. One example of this was an ongoing class dictionary students named the Code Switcher's Guide to the Rio Grande Valley. The dictionary or guide was made up of words students used in their everyday lives, along with the phonetic transcriptions and definitions. They provided sample sentences from their own usage, often often containing interstitial code switches and words built by combining and blending morphemes from both Spanish and English. Another example involved rewriting popular fairy tales and stories for children using a mix of Spanish and English along with locally recognizable phrases and settings. The students created shadow puppets out of cardboard for the fairy tale characters, and then guided groups of local middle schoolers to perform the code switch tales in a shadow puppet theater. In the Rio Grande Valley, the fact that national borders are fluid and constituted through human talk is obvious. And the fact that language use in institutional settings reproduces the ideological hegemony of the state is inescapable. Students' choices to cross the ideologically delineated boundaries of nation and language continuously highlighted the constructed nature of the nation. But these choices also made visible ever-present opportunities for making counter-hegemonic agentive choices in moment-to-moment interaction. In powerful institutions, representatives of bureaucracies, such as teachers and judges, have authority ratified by a broader society. This authority, which includes control over regulation of turns at talk, entails a greater power of bureaucrats to define the identities of those being processed by bureaucracies than those, define the identities of those being processed by bureaucracies than those being processed have. Early on, I realized that as a teacher, I had the power in the classroom to determine what we talked about and how we talked about it. I still experience this power as a heavy responsibility, but I also experience it as an opportunity to create new classroom realities. Although Susan didn't formally train me to be a teacher, it was her scholarship that prompted me to ask, if we are always in the process of making and remaking what counts as classroom interaction, what happens if we try to make something new and different out of it? Susan pointed out that the salience and prevalence of particular ideas are themselves forms of power. Every new semester, I find myself confronted with salient, powerful ideas like the college classroom, or appropriate classroom discourse, and appropriate classroom behavior. Students bring these ideas with them and use them to shape our interactions. I bring my versions of these ideas too, and with every classroom experiment and new interactive configuration, our ideas of what interactions in college classrooms are and can be shift and change. I began explicitly drawing students' awareness to how I exercise my power as a teacher and to how they could also exercise their own. The idea that we use language to create reality becomes an idea that the students and I share awareness of. This is often unsettling and scary for the students as it is for me. For me, because I know that I only have as much power in the classroom as the students grant me. We also take the idea that Susan, summarizing Gramsci, articulated as control cannot be sustained over time without the consent of the governed through ideological persuasion. And we put it on the table too, discussing how it is relevant for classroom interaction. Then sometimes there are moments when alternative ideas of classroom discourse and classroom interaction begin to emerge and become salient in our moment-to-moment turns at talk. One year, I had returned from a year of research in Indonesia and had brought back a quilted coat, batiked in deep purple. I often pulled the coat on over whatever I was wearing to stay warm in our air-conditioned classrooms. At the end of semesters, when students gave presentations, I began to notice a high percentage of people wearing purple. This was unusual. Purple wasn't our school color or the color of a local sports team. And when I asked them about it, they were surprised. They could see it too, but they hadn't planned it deliberately or collectively. All interactants have the power to shape a continually emerging reality through the process of taking turns at talk and conversation. My second year of full-time teaching, I started out my classes with everyone sitting in a circle. This meant everyone had to pick up their chairs and shove everything out to the edges of the room. The effects were immediate and denaturalizing. Students could now see each other's faces and their classmates' effective responses to their own turns at talk. Their first response to the new seating arrangement was, "So what are we going to do now?" I didn't know, and that meant that we together would figure it out in interaction. The circle has appeared again and again in the socio-spatial arrangements of my classrooms. My students here in Utrecht, in a course on language and identity, call its current iteration the circle survey. The circle survey is a simple ritual we engage in initially at the beginnings of classes, but later in the semester we use it whenever we want to input from the whole group. Someone puts a question on the table, answers the question themselves by addressing the person to one side of them, who then turns to the next person with their own answer. Their responses quickly reveal similarities and differences, which is the very stuff we need to talk about identity theory. They ask each other questions like, what did you have for breakfast? How do you travel to the university? Or what's something nice that happened over the weekend? Learning that someone spent 2 hours on a train, meaning they had to get up much earlier than you did because you could bike to class, or that someone didn't have time for breakfast in the midst of a bunch of toast, muesli, yogurt responses, brings a kind of thoughtful compassion to whatever learning happens next. Recently, Susan's research has come to play an explicit role in one of my courses by helping students to experience quickly and viscerally the merging of the ideological and material. In a unit on the role of culture and interaction, we read a section of Susan's early work on teacher-student interactions in Warm Springs schools, where students and teachers brought different theoretical norms to classroom talk. My students are mostly familiar with Susan's summary of the norms for interacting in an Anglo classroom, having some degree of control over others' turns at talk, expecting responses to follow directly from the topic at hand, and having the possibility to interrupt someone. But the Warm Springs interactional norms are rather unfamiliar. In these norms, speakers' address tends to be general. Immediate responses are not required, and you yourself control when you talk and for how long. Once we all understand the Warm Springs norms conceptually, students then have a discussion in small groups about something else, not Susan's piece, something else, but crucially, they are invited to have this discussion while trying to implement the interactional norms of the Warm Springs students. Awkward silences ensue. Students find it difficult not to address a particular person in the group. They are uncomfortable putting something on the table without getting an immediate response. They become aware of how much control they tend to exercise over others' turns at talk. And they experience what it feels like to have the freedom to determine for themselves when they will begin and end their own turns. Did Susan play by the Warm Springs interactional rules in our graduate seminar all those years ago? Susan's work constantly reminds us that the things we say and do as scholars and teachers are themselves always ideological, and that we participate in the hegemonic practices of our institutions. She invites us over and over again to take a meta perspective, to notice the material effects of our professional labor, and in the process to allow ourselves to wonder, what different effects could we produce by using the salient and prevalent ideas of our disciplines to think and do otherwise? Thank you for this, Susan.
So we will now turn to our discussant, Dick Bauman, who is also joining us via Zoom.
Hi, everyone. First, my thanks to Barb and Jackie for inviting me to participate in this panel in honor of my friend and colleague, Sue Phillips. An aside, how did I get to be the only male in an otherwise female-dominant session? That's another question. Sue and I first met 50 years ago at the conference on the ethnography of speaking that Joel Scherzer and I organized in Austin, and I've been learning from her ever since. Thanks too to the panelists for a stimulating set of papers, testifying eloquently to the productiveness of Sue's foundational contributions to our field. I won't comment on the papers in order or as fully as I might have liked if we had more time, but we'll pick out certain suggestive themes and linkages that grabbed my attention and offer food for thought. I'll start, as it happens, with the last paper, with Debbie Cole's paper, and try to pick up on what I see as interesting resonances with the paper by Rebecca Wood. No linguistic anthropologist can be unaffected by the poignant remarks of Debbie's South Texas students to the effect that I don't speak any language really. I don't speak Spanish and I don't speak English. It's fascinating and disheartening to realize just how common that self-evaluation is around the world. I first heard it many years ago in its variant form, I don't speak my language, in a documentary about young Native American students in the Northeast somewhere. But I invite you to Google it, as I did the other day, and you will be amazed, or perhaps not, at how many times it comes up. The very widespread currency of that notion testifies to the persistent and pernicious hold of the Herderian romantic nationalist ideology that constructs language as the essence of a people, the touchstone of its Volksgeist, the foundation of cultural identity, the vehicle of authentic tradition, and so on. It underlies the widespread ideology of one language, one people that we have to work so hard to dispel. It rests, of course, on a code-based conception of language as long, and of tradition as a valorized canonical selection of primordial genres constituting an intertextual chain passed down over the longue durée. If society positions you primarily in terms of ethnicity and posits that your heritage is founded on your putative ties to a nation or tribe or ethnic group, and you don't, by some measure, speak the language that is identified with that group, you run the risk of not being considered or not considering yourself as a complete person. I can't begin to go into how many ways that is problematic and damaging in today's world. The romantic nationalist ideology becomes a special problem in language revitalization projects. For one thing, it leads to programs that are code and occasionally text-based, built around the teaching of selected lexicosemantic sets, kin terms, body parts, local flora and fauna, and so on, basic sentence grammar, and a few traditionalized routines or genres like greetings and leave takings, blessing formulas and invocations, etc. I don't know the particulars of the Salish programs that Rebecca has been engaged with, but I suspect that they are in this widespread mold. But consider a second point from Debbie's paper, the exercise she describes of having her students in Utrecht organize a speech event in terms of the Native American participation frameworks that Sue so carefully elucidated at Warm Spring. Utrecht students found the exercise difficult and uncomfortable. The point I want to make is that code-based revitalization programs pass over or elide such deeply native ways of speaking or organizing spoken interaction. What is important is that such deeply rooted participation frameworks often carry over into English language interactions in native communities. The same holds true of ways of performing particular genres that are parts of the group's repertoire. That is, you can speak like an Indian in English, tell a story, tease, be polite, greet, give a speech like a Salish or Navajo or Lakota person in English. How powerful might that recognition be in developing language revitalization programs or counter-declensionist ideologies? The problem, of course, is how to get that idea across to community language and culture activists, especially as it might seem to challenge what they believe to be necessary, because, alas, we ourselves have been selling them the Herderian program for so long that it has become their own. Shifting gears becomes especially difficult in situations where the ground rules hold that the community decides, and I just help out in doing the tasks they prioritize. One other point suggested by Rebecca's paper. It looks to me like the moral evaluations that the members of the language learning classes are called upon to deliver might constitute an emergent Salish variant of what Rich Hen Ochoa calls language and culture talk, that is a register ubiquitous in Native American communities. Maybe a byproduct of these language learning classes is that the students are learning an emergent genre of Salish oratory. Diane Riskedahl's paper, like Rebecca's, revolves around collaboration and research, specifically a project investigating Syrian refugee integration in Toronto. The project involves not only interviews with refugee newcomers, but also critical debriefing sessions with research assistants in a reflexive examination of their interaction with the newcomers. These debriefing sessions, like the primary interviews, are transcribed and constitute part of the overall interactional corpus. The central research problem is how, and I'm quoting here, understandings of what it means to be a Syrian newcomer in Toronto are co-constructed through interactions with researchers and newcomers. Thus, in accordance with Sue's principle of not reifying a single encounter, but looking across multiple interactions and interactional settings, Diane focuses here on the debriefing transcripts as a reflexive vantage point on the primary interviews and on the methods and participation frameworks in terms of which the project is constructed. Several points. First, I find it noteworthy that the research assistants who actually conducted the interviews had themselves been newcomers from Syria earlier in their lives. In the course of the interviews, they draw at times upon their own earlier experiences in a gesture of alignment with the newcomers. Thus, in significant part, the project becomes a multi-generational study of what it means to be a Syrian immigrant in Toronto. To the extent that the research assistants bring their own earlier experiences into the interviews, they are adding time depth to the construction of what it is to be a Syrian newcomer in Toronto. Second, Diane describes the project in a number of places as dialogic. For the most part, the term signifies the element of interactional co-construction that is built into the research design. Still, it served to alert me to the more Bakhtinian dynamics of interdiscursivity that permeate the compound corpus made up of the interviews and the debriefing sessions. In the interview transcripts, for example, there are numerous interdiscursive resonances that tie successive turns together through repetition and parallelism in a manner that evokes Michael Silverstein's notion of the pragmatic poetry of prose or Deborah Tannen's explorations of the poetics of talk. These interdiscursive devices undergird the co-construction of interactional coherence, as well as the co-construction of what it means to be a Syrian newcomer in Toronto. The debriefing transcripts, in turn, are inherently interdiscursive insofar as they record talk that looks back upon the interviews under reflexive examination and forward to future interviews to be reshaped by the critical consideration of past talk. But note also Diane's pointing out of the presence of the voice of the principal investigator in the debriefing sessions, which recalls Judy Irvin's shadow conversations, understood to lie behind the ongoing one. So yes, these relational ties are linked in a front stage, backstage relationship, but also at the level of discourse, a deeply interdiscursive one. I turn now to Thea Strand's and Kate Graeber's papers, taking note of what I see as interesting relationships between them. They both implicate the powerful narrative that, in its various guises and inflections, undergirds the dominant ideology of modernity, that is, the evolutionary succession of pastoral nomadism to artisanal agriculture to mercantile and industrial capitalism, and illustrate how the persistence of that narrative serves as an axis of differentiation and shapes aspects of contemporary society. Thea's case, the recasting of the Valdres dialect from the traditional vernacular of the Valdres region to an objectified and commoditized object within the tourist economy of modern Norway. This reframing is an instance of a very widespread phenomenon, the folklorization of a fading agrarian way of life and its recontextualization as part of a commoditized tourist economy suffused by nostalgia and revalorized as authentic heritage. I've recently been working on a parallel case in the US, part of the core stock in trade of an early 20th century platform and recording performer, Charles Ross Taggart, who adopted the stage persona of the man from Vermont. Those of you who heard me go over this yesterday, forgive me for doing it again in this case. During the heyday of his performance and recording career, Vermont was being culturally reconstructed from a province of the sturdy yeoman farmer at the heart of the American founding myth to a relic area, depopulated and no longer viable within the developing economy of large-scale industrial agriculture, but also as a place of good old authentic American custom and a place for urban tourists to go and refresh themselves. Much like Valdres, in other words. And in Valdres, dialect loomed large among Taggart's resources for presentational display. For example, in their promotional materials for Taggart's recordings, the record companies emphasized the authenticity of his regional dialect, grounded in his true New England origins. Mr. Taggart is a real Yankee, a Victor promotional flyer proclaims, and doesn't have to put on any so-called dialects. His dialect is not assumed. An interesting dimension of contrast, though, between the Vermont and Norwegian cases is that for Taggart, the spoken dialect was the key stock in trade within the commoditized package of his public platform performances, while in Valdres, dialect seems to be heavily materialized in the form of signs, brand names, storefronts, tourist souvenirs, objects to be read rather than heard. Another possible dimension of contrast is that Taggart's Man from Vermont is somewhat ambivalent insofar as he is at the same time valorized for his ties to tradition and laughed at as a backward rube. The Valdres case doesn't seem to involve this kind of ambivalence. This all has the makings of a fascinating comparative study. In Kate's case, we're dealing with the place of herding people, if no longer strictly nomadic, still pastoral, in the modern commercial and global economy. Herding people are symbolically attractive to many peoples in modern society. At home in wide open spaces, outdoors all the time, dealing with sometimes cute animals, as in Kate's opening slide, especially cool if they ride horses or nowadays motorcycles or tough pickups. I'm married to a West Texas ranch girl, so I can testify to this stuff firsthand. When Kate writes about the businessmen and bankers mocking the herders for treating their flocks as banks on the hoof, I'm reminded of how sternly I was cautioned when I first moved to Texas, never to ask a rancher how many cows he had. It would be like asking a New Yorker, how much money do you have in the bank? But for all the patronizing, herders are still widely traditionalized as embodiments of national heritage in many parts of Central Asia, mocked but traditionalized as primordial as well. What especially fascinates me about Kate's project, at least as described in the draft she sent me, if not fully in the paper she presented today, is how productively it articulates with work in linguistic anthropology on circulation, interdiscursivity, decontextualization, and recontextualization, all inspired by the Bakhtin circle as a way of getting beyond the bounded interactional speech event in broader temporal and spatial terms. We have expanded our purview as linguistic anthropologists from the speech event to interdiscursivity, and more recently, to exploring creative ways of thinking about scale or Silversteinian ritual centers of semiosis, their attendant genres, and ways of driving the extended reach of discourse among shifting regimes of value and mechanisms of valorization. Kate's project might be seen as adapting these emergent frameworks from a focus on language to other semiotic systems. In her case, Kashmir, as it moves from the herders' Kashmir poles in Mongolia to China, Scotland, Italy, Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hong Kong. What is the Kashmir equivalent of the wine tasting note that was so central in Michael's wino-linguistics? All these topics should make for lively discussion, and I look forward to seeing the further development of all these projects as the participants continue to pursue them. Thank you.
So we'd like to thank everyone, papers, discussant. Thank you so much, Dick, for those wonderful comments. And we need to start wrapping up and letting the room set up for the next panel. But Susan, did you want to just say a couple of quick words?
Is this microphone on? I think you guys are wonderful. It's been great to see you. I love the papers. It's fascinating to see what new ideas you're bringing into the field and what you're leaving behind and what you're taking forward. I'm just proud of all of you. Thank you very much.